What are we up to today? In Zamboland, I was 50-50 on whether to make these videos as ever. The channel's about falafels, van restoration, the Bob Cave, lots of other bits and bobs. However, we are looking at a horrific anniversary this Friday, which will be 1 year we have had a raging war in Europe. Kind of hard to get your head around about, isn't it? There has been a hot war in Europe against possibly two military superpowers. Anyway, this is video 1. I may do another couple over the next couple of days. It's my opinion. It's me spitballing again. It's not based on anything else other than my tacit interest in European, Russian, global politics. So let's look at the origins or the reasons behind what actually happened to start the Ukraine war. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed, what does it say, in 1991. The Soviet government, after 3 years, finally allowed the Baltic states to declare independence from the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. So in 1991, it started collapsing. Where am I going to go with this? So it started collapsing in 1991. And I'm running out of words here. The Soviet government were issued verbal and written guarantees from NATO and Western countries that NATO wouldn't move 1 centimetre further east than it was in 1991. Now, all these years later, we know that's rubbish because NATO have now got bases in Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and they were trying to put them into, oh, there they go, computer's been off. They were trying to put them into the Ukraine, which was a massive red line for Russia. Now, if you think about it, that's not really the Soviet Union, so it could be argued that the deal NATO and the West had with the Soviet Union was null and void because the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. That makes sense. However, Russia was on its backside and an independent Russia was on its backside. It was skint. Oligarchs went in there and absolutely tore the country apart, and it took maybe 10 years for any semblance of normality to come back to it. So here's the second thing we're going to do in this upload. This is called the INF Treaty. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was again signed between the Americans, NATO and Russia. And the idea was they banned, you can see it here, nuclear weapons with a range of between 500 and 1,000 kilometres and 1,500 kilometres. It turns out there were 2,692 nuclear missiles in Europe across the border between the Soviet Union and Europe. Let's look at that again. 2,692 missiles. Is that 2,800? It doesn't matter. If you think about the amount of capital cities there were in Europe, even airports and military bases, I think Russia always had, well, the Soviet Union / Russia always had more nukes than the West. However, that's more than enough to wipe out every capital city, every NATO base in Europe, every airport. That's the type of things we would hit. If we have a look at where the Russians went when they attacked the Ukraine, the first thing they hit were all the airfields and military installations. So if they'd used, if we half that, what's that, 1,300 nukes against Europe. There wouldn't have been much of Europe left with us. So I think behind the INF Treaty, Ronald Reagan was shot at some kind of event he was working at, and he seen a film about a nuclear attack, and he was absolutely gobsmacked. So he contacted the people in the CIA or NATO or his military advisors and says to them, how powerful are these weapons? And when the guy said, look, Ronald, it's way worse than the film that you just watched. These things are absolutely devastating weapons. So Reagan, who I didn't have a lot of time for, he's kind of the architect of Western downfall. Him and Margaret Thatcher absolutely, they sowed the seeds that would collapse America and the UK's economy a few years later by their absolute passion for free market capitalism. Thatcher and Reagan sent America and Britain along the road of deindustrialisation. Now we're into the Ukraine war for a year. The ability to manufacture steel, weapons, have a strong infrastructure in your country has been reinforced, hasn't it? So communism ended around about 1991. Before that, we had the INF Treaty to remove 2,800 nuclear weapons from Europe. I lived through all that. There was like a weight on your shoulders all the time. You were constantly worried that the nukes would start firing off. So NATO did expand, and I think President Donald Trump, I should have got that on the computer, but I didn't bother. Donald Trump left the INF Treaty before, when he was president. So I think, although the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, NATO is more or less on what is now Russia's border. And Donald Trump pulling out the INF Treaty meant that America and NATO were prepared to put thousands of nuclear weapons back across a border where they could easily hit Russian cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, etc., Latvia and Lithuania. The little Baltic countries are very, very close to St. Petersburg, aren't they? So this is number one of why I think we are where we are with the war in Ukraine. I've been doing a couple of political uploads recently. Nobody really watches them, so again, I'm not an academic. I'm not a professor of political history or anything like that. I'm just giving you my thoughts on it. It's a very emotive subject because tens of thousands of people have died in the past year, and Europe seems to be going down the toilet for what I would reckon would be American business interests, but more of that to go. So the two things were the end of communism and NATO's guarantees, both written and verbal, not to move closer to the former USSR border, or what is now the Russian border. They did move closer to the Russian border. Then Trump scrapping the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, where we managed to get rid of nearly 3,000 nuclear weapons in the 1980s and 1990s. So this is end of part one, and I'll do another couple over the next couple of days. My own opinion, you can make of it what you want, or not make of it what you want. But I think that's the roots, the nuts and bolts. It could be argued that by 1947 it was obvious that Europe had a major issue with the USSR. It could also be argued that the USSR was quite happy just selling Europe natural resources, couldn't it? The way Russia had been quite happy selling Europe natural resources. But anyway, going to log out in that one. That's part one. And the two things to remember are the end of communism, the guarantees of no NATO expansionism, and Donald Trump binning the INF Treaty. Okay, look forward to part two. Right, bye-bye.